In just 17 seconds, J.D. Vance turned a room of 500 into complete, breathless silence. It happened after Mitt Romney, a man once seen as the very image of power and prestige, mocked him openly on national television. The cameras captured every smirk, every dismissive glance. And yet what followed wasn't loud or angry. It was one line, one truth, a line so raw, so powerful that the room froze. The powerful senator who had just laughed had nothing left to say. Today we revisit that moment, not just as an event in politics, but as a story about courage, dignity, and what it means to stand your ground when no one expects you to. As you listen, remember, this is a dramatized retelling, a crafted story inspired by moments that could have been, but speak to truths we all recognize. The characters and dialogue may be imagined, but the emotions, the struggles, the quiet victories, those are as real as anything we've lived. Let this story remind us of the power of words and the strength it takes to speak them. So ask yourself, what could a man say in just 17 seconds to humble power itself? Stay with us. The answer may change how you see courage forever. Stay with us. Some moments don't just tell a story, they remind us who we are. Morning broke over the Capitol beneath a heavy sky, a sky that seemed to mirror the weight of the day. The first light of dawn barely cut through the clouds, casting the grand marble dome in hues of steel gray. The streets below, usually humming with tourists and city workers, were already clogged with media trucks, satellite dishes tilted like watchful eyes, reporters rehearsing their lines in hushed, tense voices. Today was no ordinary day. Today, the nation was watching, waiting for a moment that might shape its future. Inside a modest corner office, high up in a building overlooking the Capitol, J.D. Vance stood silently at the window. He wasn't looking at the reporters or the Capitol's dome. His gaze seemed far beyond that, as if he were searching for something no longer there. In his hand, he turned over a worn, faded work glove. The leather was cracked at the seams, the fingertips darkened with grease from long-ago factory floors. It had belonged to his father, a man J.D. barely spoke of in public, but one whose memory shaped everything about this day. His thumb traced the stitched initials on the cuff. T.V. Thomas Vance, a man who, like so many others, had spent his life in the mills and plants that once powered America. A man who came home with tired eyes and calloused hands, and who left this world too soon, worn down by a system that no longer seemed to value men like him. J.D. closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that glove, as if it carried all the hopes and failures of generations. Far beyond the glass in homes across the country, the nation stirred. In a steel town bar in Ohio, where the neon light flickered over chip tables, men gathered over black coffee and bitter memories. One leaned toward the TV mounted above the bar and muttered, "Let's see if he really fights for us, or if he's just like the rest." In a small living room in Michigan, a mother with weary eyes settled onto the edge of her couch, children still asleep upstairs. She gripped the remote tightly as if changing the channel might somehow change their fortune. On the screen, the scroll beneath the anchors read, "Vance's jobs bill faces crucial test today." In a factory break room in Pennsylvania, where the machines outside hummed a tired song of survival, workers crowded around an old TV, grainy but still their window to what mattered. One of them, a man with soot-streaked hands, stared at the screen and said quietly, "Today decides if anyone still fights for us." J.D. opened his eyes again, breath fogging the cold glass. He could see the steps of the Capitol now, where reporters clustered, where the powerful would soon walk, and where he would soon face one of the sharpest tongues in modern politics. Mitt Romney, the man who had already begun mocking his plan in interviews, calling it sentimental, misguided, and dangerous for America's future. J.D. didn't flinch, but deep inside he knew the stakes. This wasn't just about policy. It wasn't just another debate. For him, for the people watching in those bars, homes, and factories, this was about whether America still had room for men like his father. A soft knock at his door broke the silence. His aide's voice tentative, "Sir, it's time." J.D. gave the glove one last look, slid it gently into his jacket pocket, and straightened his tie. Outside, the storm clouds hung low over the Capitol, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. And somewhere across the country, millions of Americans leaned a little closer to their screens, afraid, deeply afraid, of missing what might come next. JD stepped away from the window, the weight of his father's glove still warm in his pocket. The sound of distant voices, the shuffle of aides, and the muted rumble of news crews echoed faintly through the corridors. The storm outside, heavy with unspoken fears, now seemed to creep into these very walls. He glanced once more at the Capitol steps through the monitor in his office. And there, emerging from a sleek black sedan, came the man the cameras had been waiting for. Mitt Romney. Even in the low, uncertain morning light, Romney's presence seemed to command the frame. His suit was immaculate, pressed to perfection. His silver hair caught the glow of the camera lights as if polished for the occasion. Every step he took toward the Capitol was measured, confident, the walk of a man who had stood at the summit of power and knew what it felt like to look down from there. Microphones shot forward as he approached, the air crackling with anticipation. Reporters called out, "Senator Romney, thoughts on the Vance bill? Do you expect a clash today? Can Vance rally the votes?" Romney slowed, allowed himself a small smirk, the kind that didn't just answer the question, but dismissed it altogether. "We need vision," he said, his voice steady, his words sharp as a blade beneath silk. "Not backward thinking dressed up as nostalgia." The cameras flashed, catching the glint in his eye, the practiced ease of his expression. In that single sentence, he had framed the day's battle. Vance was the past, clinging to faded hopes. Romney was the future, or so he wanted the world to believe. Inside, JD stood still, watching this unfold on the monitor. His jaw tightened, just slightly, but enough for his aide to notice and pause at the door. JD said nothing. He didn't need to. That one look, that one silent clench, spoke louder than any words. The storm hadn't just begun, it was here. And yet, even as Romney's words echoed through the halls, reaching ears eager for drama, there was something beneath the surface that only those truly watching could sense. It was in the way Romney's gaze flickered, just once, toward the camera lens as if checking his reflection, ensuring the image of control held firm. It was in the slight pause after his sentence, as though he expected applause that didn't come. Out on the Capitol steps, the wind tugged at Romney's coat. The storm clouds overhead rolled darker now, as if nature itself conspired to thicken the tension of the day. He adjusted his tie, nodded once to the cluster of journalists, and made his way inside. And in homes, bars, and factories across the country, those watching leaned in closer. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. The polished statesman with his practiced words, and somewhere in the shadows of the building, the son of a steel worker waiting to step into the light. The monitor in JD's office went dark as the feed switched angles. He drew a breath, slow and deep. The air felt heavy, charged with what was coming. His hand brushed the edge of the glove in his pocket once more. Not for luck, but as a reminder, this wasn't about outshining Romney. This was about standing for those who had no voice in rooms like this. And so, as the echo of Romney's footsteps faded into the great chambers of Congress, JD turned toward the door. His time had come. The echo of Romney's footsteps had barely faded when JD entered the committee room. The space felt colder than he remembered, its grand arches and polished wood now looming like silent witnesses to the battle about to begin. The murmur of voices filled the chamber, aides whispering final reminders, reporters adjusting their equipment, senators shifting in their seats. Cameras ringed the room like a wall of glass eyes, their red lights blinking, ready to beam every word, every glance, to a nation waiting outside these walls. JD walked with purpose but not haste, feeling the weight of history settle on his shoulders with every step. He could sense Romney's presence before he saw him. The air seemed to tighten, charged by the rivalry that was no longer hidden. And when their eyes met across the room, the noise around them seemed, for a heartbeat, to dim. Romney sat poised, his expression unreadable save for the faintest trace of the same smirk he'd worn on the Capitol steps. His polished cuff rested lightly on the desk, fingers steepled as if already confident in victory. JD's gaze did not waver. There was no need for words. The clash had begun the moment they entered this room. The chair of the committee, an older senator with a voice that could still command a room despite years of battles, lifted the gavel. The chatter faded, the air thick with anticipation. "Let history remember this day," the chair declared, voice echoing against marble and oak. The gavel fell, a sharp crack that seemed to split the tension in two, and with it, the hearing began. JD took his seat, the leather cold beneath him. He could feel the eyes upon him, not just from across the table, but from every angle. The cameras, the gallery, the millions beyond the walls who had pinned their hopes or their doubts on what he might do today. Romney shifted slightly, leaning in as if ready to pounce the moment JD spoke. The gesture wasn't lost on JD, but he had prepared for this, not just in the sleepless nights of drafting the bill or the briefings with advisors, but in the long, hard years of watching men like his father be cast aside. This wasn't theater for him. This was personal. A reporter's camera clicked loudly as it captured the first full image of JD and Romney seated across from each other. Two faces that represented not just opposing policies, but opposing visions of America's soul. The first speaker began the formalities, reading the title of the bill, reciting procedural notes. The words floated over JD, distant and hollow. His mind stayed locked on the work glove in his pocket, on the steel towns, the shuttered plants, the hollowed-out communities that could no longer wait for another empty promise. Romney glanced at the cameras as the opening statements began, his posture effortless, his tone, when he finally spoke, smooth as polished stone. "We are here," he said with practiced warmth, "because the future demands our courage to move forward, not cling to the past." A few heads in the room nodded. JD's fingers brushed the edge of the glove, his heart steady. The storm outside had moved inside now. The first shots weren't fired with weapons, but with words, and they had just begun to echo through the chamber. And beyond these walls, in homes, in bars, in break rooms, across the nation, the people leaned in closer, sensing that something in this room today would not be easily forgotten. The chair's voice faded into the stillness that followed, and for a breath, the room seemed suspended in time. Then Romney rose. He didn't glance at his notes. He didn't need to. Every word had been rehearsed, every phrase sharpened to draw blood without ever raising his voice. He adjusted his cuff, let his eyes sweep the room, and began. "We gather here today because America faces great challenges," he said, his tone rich with practiced sincerity. "But to meet those challenges, we must have the courage to look forward, not cling to what is behind us." He let the words settle, watching as a few heads nodded, those sympathetic, or perhaps just eager for the comfort of familiar rhetoric. Romney's gaze flickered briefly toward the cameras, ensuring they captured the moment, then returned to his audience. Senator Vance's proposal, while no doubt well-intentioned, romanticizes a past that no longer exists. The world has changed. The industries we mourn are not coming back, not because we lack will, but because history moves on. There it was, Edie, the first true cut, polished, precise, and beneath it, a quiet but unmistakable dismissal of JD's entire mission. JD sat still, his face unreadable, but inside he could feel the heat of those words, as if Romney's voice had found its mark and pressed it hard. His fingers moved almost reflexively to the edge of the glove in his pocket, grounding himself in the memory it carried. Romney's speech continued, flowing like a river that seemed gentle on the surface, but carried a dangerous undercurrent. "Global trade is not our enemy," he said, voice rising just enough to command attention. "It is America's future. It is how we lead, how we prosper, how we secure our place in the world." There was a soft ripple of approval, not from the public gallery, but from the suited figures seated behind him, the representatives of corporate interests who had come to witness this display. JD heard it, the low hum of laughter, the shared confidence of those who felt their side was winning already. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if the weight of the argument pressed on every listener. Romney's cadence was steady, his phrasing deliberate, each point wrapped in the language of inevitability, that to resist globalization was not brave, but foolish, that to fight for lost jobs was not noble, but naive. I respect my colleague's passion, Romney offered, his voice dipped in courtesy that felt more like condescension. But passion must yield to reason, and reason tells us that looking backward will not put food on the tables of American families. JD said nothing. His jaw remained set, his eyes fixed not on Romney, but on a point beyond him, as though looking through the words, past the polished veneer, to the truths Romney's speech carefully avoided. Romney drew his remarks to a close with a final, cutting flourish. America thrives when it dares to compete, not when it hides behind walls of nostalgia. He reclaimed his seat with the calm confidence of a man who believed he had set the tone for the day, that the battle was already half won. The soft hum of approval lingered like a faint drumbeat of victory. But JD's stillness was not defeat. It was the calm before a storm that had not yet begun. And beyond those walls, in homes and factories, in bars and break rooms, Americans watching felt the weight of Romney's words, and the quiet question that now hung in the air. What would JD say next? The echo of Romney's final words still hung in the chamber, their polished edges slicing through the heavy air. The hum of approval from corporate allies faded into a charged silence. All eyes seemed to turn, waiting for JD to rise, to strike back, to answer the vision that Romney had so confidently declared. But JD remained still. He didn't look at Romney, didn't glance at the cameras. His hands rested quietly on the table, but beneath the surface, his grip on the edge of his father's glove grew tighter. His gaze fixed on the polished wood before him, but his mind had already slipped beyond these walls. He saw not the grandeur of the chamber, but the hollowed-out streets of the steel town where he'd grown up. The place that had once pulsed with the rhythm of machines, now silent as a graveyard. He saw the shuttered factories, windows broken like the promises made to the people who'd worked there. He saw the eviction notices nailed to doors, the families packing what little they had left into rusted pickups, faces pale with fear of the unknown. And then, clearest of all, he saw the boy. A boy standing in the cold outside a small house, its windows dark, its door hanging loose on a bent hinge. The boy turned to his father, a man with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, and asked the question that had haunted JD ever since. "Where's our home, Dad?" The memory hit like a weight to the chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. JD felt the glove in his pocket, the cracked leather rough beneath his fingertips, and he held it as if it were the last solid thing in a world that had long since crumbled for so many. The room around him waited. Cameras stayed trained on his stillness, as if searching for a flicker of emotion, a sign that Romney's words had found their mark. But JD gave them nothing. Not yet. His time would come. He let the silence stretch, not out of hesitation, but out of purpose. Let them sit in the echoes of those polished words. Let them feel the weight of what had been said. Let them wonder if he would answer at all. In that moment, JD wasn't thinking of speeches or strategy. He was thinking of the fathers who had no answers, of the mothers who held their families together with strength that no camera would ever capture, of the towns that had been left behind in the rush toward the so-called future. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in resolve. The time for words would come, and when it did, his words wouldn't be smooth or rehearsed or designed for sound bites. They would come from the place Romney's speech had carefully avoided, the quiet pain of those who had nothing left to lose. The chair cleared his throat softly, shifting the proceedings forward. JD lifted his gaze at last, eyes steady, heart sure. He was ready. The image of JD's steady gaze lingered on the screens of millions as the hearing room gave way to the wider world beyond its walls. In homes, in diners, in break rooms scattered across the nation, people watched with restless eyes and tightening jaws. The polished rhetoric of Romney, the heavy silence of JD, it all played out not just in Washington, but in the hearts of those who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to speak for them. In a corner diner in Ohio, where the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease mixed with the chill of a winter morning, A veteran in a frayed cap leaned over his plate, eyes fixed on the small TV mounted above the counter. His knuckles were pale where they gripped his mug. When Romney's words replayed in the broadcast highlight, the veteran shook his head, voice low but firm enough to draw glances from others. "Same old talk," he muttered, bitterness cutting through each word. "Where's someone who cares about us?" A waitress, no stranger to hard days herself, paused as she refilled a cup. "Maybe this Vance guy's different," she offered quietly, though the uncertainty in her voice echoed the uncertainty in the room. Miles away in a modest living room in Michigan, a mother sat stiffly on the edge of her couch, eyes flicking between the screen and the staircase where her children still slept. The bills on the table in front of her looked like they might swallow her whole. The sound of Romney's speech, "Global trade is America's future," felt like a door closing. In a factory break room in Pennsylvania, men and women gathered around a flickering old TV. One of them, a middle-aged worker with oil-stained hands, stared at the screen with a look that was part anger, part exhaustion. "All I hear is how we've got to move on." "Move on to what? There's nothing left." The tension wasn't just in the words that had been spoken, but in the silence that followed. The silence of J.D. Vance. A silence that left the nation holding its breath, wondering if he would rise, if he would fight back, if this would be the day someone finally said what they all felt. Back inside the Capitol, as J.D.'s stillness filled the room like a challenge unspoken, his team watched from the sidelines. Their eyes moved between J.D. and the restless senators, between the cameras and the man they had pledged to follow. One aide leaned in, voice low but urgent. "Hold the line, sir. They'll see the truth. Just hold the line." J.D. didn't answer. He didn't need to. The line had already been drawn, not just in that room but across the country, between those who believed in the comfort of polished words and those who knew that comfort had long since left their towns. The hearing pressed on, the air thick with waiting, and beyond the walls of power, in places forgotten by policy papers and campaign speeches, the people leaned in closer. Not because they believed yet. Belief had been burned too many times before, but because, for the first time in a long time, they wanted to. The tension in the room had thickened, the silence that followed the opening exchanges stretching long enough for unease to take root. The chair cleared his throat, ready to move the hearing forward, when J.D. Vance quietly signaled that he had something more to offer. All eyes turned to him. This was unexpected. His team exchanged glances, unsure of what was coming. But J.D.'s gaze was steady, and without a word of preamble, he gestured toward the doors at the back of the chamber. The doors opened, and in stepped a man who seemed, at first glance, out of place among the polished suits and marble grandeur of the Capitol. His work boots scuffed from years of labor, his hands rough, his jacket worn thin at the elbows. The cameras swung toward him, lenses zooming in as the room's hum of chatter fell away. He walked with the weight of a man who carried not just his own burden, but that of a town left behind. J.D. rose to greet him, offering a firm nod that spoke more than words could. Together they approached the witness table, the steel worker settling into the chair, with a hesitation that came from knowing he didn't belong in rooms like this. And yet today his presence mattered more than all the prepared speeches combined. J.D.'s voice was calm, but carried a quiet power as he introduced him. "I'd like the committee to hear directly from the people this bill is meant to serve." The man's voice trembled as he began, his eyes glistening, but he didn't falter. He spoke of the mill that had once been the heart of his town, a mill that had provided not just jobs but purpose, dignity, and a future. He spoke of the day the gates closed for the last time, of the families that had packed up and left, of the homes abandoned to weeds and time. Then, with hands that shook despite their strength, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small creased envelope. He opened it carefully as though it were something sacred and withdrew a faded piece of paper. "This," he said, his voice breaking, "was my father's final paycheck." He held it up, and for a moment, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if recognizing the weight of what was being shown. The check was small, the ink faded, but it represented something far greater. "This wasn't just a job, it was our hope," he continued, his words raw with truth. "When the mill died, so did that hope, and no speech about the future can bring it back." The room grew somber. the energy shifting as the steelworkers' simple honesty pierced through the polished arguments that had filled the chamber minutes before. Romney, for all his composure, shifted slightly in his seat, the certainty in his posture faltering for just a breath. JD didn't speak. He didn't need to. The witness's words had done what no policy paper or statistic could. And across the country, in those same homes and diners and break rooms where the people watched with guarded hearts, something began to stir. Not belief, not yet, but the fragile beginnings of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally listening. The steelworkers' words still hung in the air, their raw honesty leaving the room heavy with reflection. Even the cameras, usually eager for motion, seemed to hesitate, lingering on the image of that final paycheck, on the man's trembling hands, on JD's quiet, steady presence beside him. For a moment, the chamber felt united in the gravity of what had been shared, a glimpse into the human cost hidden beneath policies and sound bites. But the silence was brief. A chair creaked as Mitt Romney rose, his movements precise, his expression unchanged. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed his tie, and let his eyes sweep the room. The weight of the moment didn't faze him, or if it did, he didn't show it. His voice, when it came, was sharp, polished, cutting through the heaviness like a cold wind. "We cannot legislate nostalgia," he declared, his words crisp, measured, leaving no space for sentiment. "America must innovate, or it will perish." The quiet was broken, first by the echo of his voice, then by the smattering of applause from the suited figures seated behind him. They weren't the people in shuttered towns or factory break rooms. They were the ones who had bet their futures on globalization, on progress measured in quarterly reports and stock prices. The sound of their approval, hollow as it was, filled the space where reflection had been only moments before. Romney continued, building his rhythm, his confidence growing with every word. "We honor the past by learning from it, not by trying to rebuild what time and technology have moved beyond. The industries we mourn cannot be revived by wishful thinking or government mandates. The world has changed, and if America refuses to change with it, we doom ourselves to decline." His cadence was masterful, each phrase crafted to sound like reason, like inevitability. Yet beneath the surface, his message was clear. There was no going back. The loss, the heartbreak, those were the price of progress, and no bill, no speech, no heartfelt testimony could alter that truth. Romney's gaze flicked toward JD, the smallest glimmer of challenge in his eyes. "We can feel for those who've been left behind, but feeling is not policy, and policy must serve the future, not the past." The tension crackled, the room once again divided. On one side, the quiet supporters of JD's cause, stirred by the testimony they just heard. On the other, the polished ranks of business lobbyists, their applause more confident now, emboldened by Romney's return to familiar ground. JD remained seated, his hands folded, the steelworker's words still closer to his heart than anything Romney had just said. But he didn't look down. He didn't shrink. His eyes stayed fixed on Romney, steady, as if seeing beyond the well-worn lines and practiced delivery to the hollow space behind them. Romney concluded with the force of finality, as if expecting no further argument. "Let us not dishonor the future by clinging to the past." He reclaimed his seat, smoothing his notes, the applause of his allies fading like the echo of a bell in a cold, empty hall. But the storm he thought he had calmed was only gathering strength. And across the country, in the hearts of those watching, the question burned brighter. Would JD answer? The final note of Romney's words echoed and faded, leaving the room hanging between applause and anticipation. The business allies behind him settled back, confident they had just witnessed a masterclass in reason. But beneath the polished surface of that speech, a tension still hummed in the air. Something unspoken, waiting. JD didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it stretch, let the weight of Romney's certainty settle on the room like a stone too heavy to lift. And then, without fanfare or flourish, JD rose. His movements were calm, deliberate, a quiet defiance that needed no grand gesture. The room, sensing the shift, fell still. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, lenses focused, red lights blinking as if in expectation of something they hadn't seen before. JD's voice when it came wasn't loud, but it was clear, measured, firm, carrying through the chamber without force, as if the truth had no need to shout. "You call it nostalgia," he began, his gaze steady on Romney, his words aimed at the heart of the argument just made. "I call it survival." The simplicity of the line cut through the chamber like a blade honed not on rhetoric, but on experience. A murmur rippled through the room, soft but unmistakable. A shift, a stirring, the first cracks in the polished armor of certainty that had blanketed the hearing so far. JD didn't look at the cameras. He didn't need their approval. His eyes stayed on Romney, but his words reached far beyond him. "You speak of moving forward, of embracing the future as if that means leaving our people behind. But what future do we have if we abandon those who built this country? If we let entire towns fall so that stock prices can rise?" The lobbyists sat stiffer now, their earlier applause forgotten. JD's voice carried no anger, only the weight of hard truth. "This isn't about clinging to the past. It's about making sure there's a future worth reaching for. One where families aren't forced out of their homes, where fathers can answer their children when they ask, 'Where's our home, Dad?'" Across the chamber, a senator who had nodded along with Romney moments before now shifted in his seat, unease flickering across his face. The gallery leaned in closer, drawn not by spectacle, but by the quiet force of conviction. JD drew a breath, steady, as if gathering the room to him. "You can call it what you like, nostalgia, sentiment, resistance. But where I come from, we call it survival. And survival isn't something we apologize for." There was no applause. Not yet. Just silence. Heavy, waiting. The kind of silence that spoke louder than any cheer, that said the ground beneath the debate had just begun to shift. JD let the moment hold. He met Romney's gaze one last time, then turned and resumed his seat. His hand brushed the glove in his pocket, a reminder of why he stood there, of who he spoke for. And as he settled, the tension in the room didn't ease. It deepened, charged now with something more powerful than argument, the sense that the fight had truly begun. And beyond those walls, in homes and shops and union halls, Americans watched and felt, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that someone was speaking for them. The quiet strength of JD's words still lingered in the chamber, like the final note of a song that refused to fade. For a moment it felt as if the room had been reclaimed, as if conviction had triumphed over polished rhetoric. But then Romney moved. He didn't rush, didn't betray even a flicker of the unease that might have stirred beneath his well-guarded surface. With the calm of a man confident in his tools, he stood again, his hand resting lightly on the folder that now lay open before him. "Passion, Senator Vance, is admirable," Romney began, his voice smooth as ever. "But we are not here to legislate passion. We are here to legislate responsibly." He lifted several sheets of paper, clean, crisp, official. The kind of documents that carried weight in rooms like this, not because of what they said, but because of who had written them. "I have here statements from some of our nation's most respected economists, names I'm sure many of you know well." He let the pages fan slightly, as if displaying not just paper, but authority itself. "They agree on this, without hesitation. This bill is not the answer. In fact, they warn it would do more harm than good." Romney's eyes swept the room, pausing just long enough to let the implications sink in. "Even those who share your concern for our working families at Senator Vance, even your allies in principle, fear that your plan will damage the very economy those families depend on." There it was, the masterstroke. Not an attack on JD's heart, but on his judgment. Not a dismissal of his intent, but of his competence. The shift in the room was subtle at first, but unmistakable. The soft murmur of staffers exchanging glances. A senator on the fence leaning back in his chair, arms folding as caution replaced curiosity. The quiet hum of the cameras capturing every flicker of doubt that now crept into the faces of those who moments before had begun to lean toward JD's side. JD felt it, the cold that wasn't in the air, but in the atmosphere, the sudden sense of distance as the room began to turn. His fingers brushed the edge of the glove in his pocket again, grounding himself, but he could feel how the tide of perception was shifting. Romney pressed on, voice steady, not triumphant. That would have been too obvious, but firm, as though laying down a truth that no reasonable person could dispute. We honor our working families by pursuing policies that help them thrive in the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. He placed the documents down with care, as if their presence on the table sealed the point beyond further debate. The applause didn't come this time. This was no place for victory laps. But the approving nods of certain senators, the quiet looks exchanged between business representatives spoke just as clearly. Romney reclaimed his seat, his expression composed, the hint of finality in his posture. He had played his hand, one forged not in emotion, but in the cold calculus of expertise and power. And in that moment it seemed to those watching that the storm J.D. had stirred might have just been calmed. But J.D. knew better. The storm was still there. It was simply gathering strength in the silence that followed. The weight of Romney's words and those neatly stacked statements still hung over the chamber as the hearing recessed. Senators rose, some nodding to one another in quiet consensus, others retreating into small clusters to murmur their thoughts out of earshot. J.D. remained seated for a moment longer, his fingers resting lightly on the table's edge, the glove still tucked safely in his pocket. He could feel the shift, not in policy, not yet, but in perception. The room's warmth, whatever flicker of empathy or curiosity his earlier words had kindled, seemed to have cooled beneath the frost of Romney's masterful play. Outside those marble walls, the media machine was already in motion. Cameras caught J.D. leaving the chamber, the flash of bulbs stuttering like a storm, as reporters shouted questions he didn't stop to answer. He had nothing to say just yet, not to them. Within minutes, the networks filled their screens with analysis. Panels of well-dressed pundits sat in sleek studios, their voices confident, their judgments swift. "This is what happens when passion overrides practicality," one commentator said, her tone clipped, certain. "Vance's proposal is little more than a populist fantasy." "Dangerous," another agreed. "It plays well to certain audiences, sure, but in reality, it threatens the very economic stability these communities rely on." The camera cut to footage of J.D. in the hearing, his quiet defiance now framed as stubbornness. The steelworker's heartfelt testimony reduced to a symbol, one of many in what the pundits described as a misguided crusade. Headlines rolled across screens in bold letters. J.D. Vance, bold vision or national gamble. Vance bill faces fire from experts, media, and markets. Populism on trial, J.D. Vance's risky bet. In homes and offices, on phones and tablets, the country watched, and the seeds of doubt that had been planted in the chamber began to take root. J.D.'s allies, those who had quietly championed his resolve, who had believed in the moral clarity of his cause, felt the weight of that doubt too. Conversations behind closed doors turned cautious. Some who had spoken in his defense the day before now urged moderation. "We're with you, J.D.," one confidant said in private, "but maybe it's time to rethink the framing. Find some middle ground." But J.D. said nothing in reply. The noise swirled around him, loud, relentless. But inside he held to his purpose. The media could call him a dreamer, a gambler, a fool. The experts could write their statements. The pundits could fill the airwaves. But none of them had seen the shuttered factories up close. None of them had faced the boy who'd asked, "Where's our home, Dad?" Still, the weight bore down. His resolve had been tested before, but never quite like this. The isolation of conviction in the face of a tidal wave of opposition was colder, lonelier than he'd imagined. Yet as night fell and the headlines continued to flash their verdicts, J.D. stood firm. The storm had not passed, it had only begun. And deep down he knew, the only way through it was forward. The lights of the Capitol seemed distant now, as if the building itself had turned its back, leaving J.D. to the cold night air in his thoughts. He walked without speaking, without destination, the soft echo of his footsteps on stone lost beneath the hush of the sleeping city. The storm of voices, the headlines that had filled the day, still echoed in his mind. But out here, beneath the quiet watch of the monuments, they seemed smaller. The Lincoln Memorial loomed ahead, its columns pale and solemn against the darkness. J.D. paused at the base of the steps, his gaze lifting to the seated figure above. The marble face, weathered by time and memory, seemed to meet his own with a steady calm. A man who had known storms greater than this, who had faced a nation at war with itself, who had been called a fool, a tyrant, a dreamer, and had endured. J.D. drew a slow breath, the chill of the night filling his lungs, clearing the noise from his head. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers closing around the worn work glove that had been his companion through these days. The leather felt heavier tonight, as if it carried not just his father's memory, but the weight of every hope pinned on him by those who had watched the hearing, those who had dared to believe for a moment that maybe, just maybe, someone was fighting for them. The voices of the pundits, the polished scorn of Romney's words, the cautious retreat of allies, all of it pressed against him like the night itself. But beneath that weight, something steadier pulsed, quiet but unbroken. He heard his father's voice as if the man stood beside him once more, not as he had been at the end, tired, worn down, but as J.D. remembered him best, strong, certain, a man who could make the world seem right with just a word. "Don't quit when it's hard," the memory whispered. "Fight harder." J.D. let the words settle, their warmth a shield against the cold. He lifted his gaze again to the great stone figure, the man who had known what it meant to stand alone for what was right, who had carried the weight of a divided nation and still believed in its promise. The city around him was quiet, but the storm within him stirred anew, not of anger, but of purpose. The glove in his hand wasn't just a reminder of where he'd come from. It was a promise, one he meant to keep. Slowly, J.D. turned from the steps, his breath misting in the night air. The path ahead was shadowed, uncertain, but he walked it with steady strides, each step carrying him not away from the storm, but toward its heart. Morning came heavy with cloud, the air in the capital thick with anticipation as the hearing reconvened. The previous day's storm, Romney's precision strikes, the media's rebuke, the doubt that crept into once steadfast allies, still hung over the room like a fog. But when J.D. entered, something in his step, in the quiet focus of his eyes, hinted at a shift unseen but deeply felt. The murmurs that rippled through the chamber fell quiet as he approached the table. No papers in his hands, no prepared speech. Just the worn work glove, cradled carefully as if it were as fragile as the memories it carried. The cameras found him at once, their lenses focusing not on polished notes, but on the cracked leather that had crossed generations to rest in his grip today. J.D. took his place at the front, pausing long enough to let the silence stretch, to let every eye settle on him. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, low enough that the room leaned in to catch every word, yet clear enough that it filled the space with quiet authority. "I didn't come here today to argue numbers with experts," he began, his gaze sweeping the room, pausing briefly on Romney. "I didn't come to trade sound bites or to win headlines. I came here because of this." He lifted the glove slightly, holding it where all could see. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the frayed seams, the dark stains at the fingertips, proof of work, of sacrifice, of a life lived building something that mattered. "This belonged to my father, a man who worked steel, who came home with hands as rough as this leather, hands that shaped the world my family lived in. A man who, like too many others, watched that world vanish." J.D. paused, his fingers brushing the initials stitched into the cuff. "TV, Thomas Vance, a name lost to history, like the towns he worked for, like the hopes that once filled them." The chamber was still, the weight of his words sinking deep. "And I remember the day we lost our home. I remember standing in the cold, beside a father who had no answers left. And I remember the question that broke us both." His voice softened, but carried further for its softness. "Why don't we have a home, Dad?" The line fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending unseen ripples through senators, staffers, even the hardened faces in the gallery. "This isn't nostalgia. This is survival. This is what it means to fight for those who built this nation and were left behind when it no longer seemed convenient to remember them." Romney sat motionless, his earlier confidence now met with something he couldn't easily counter. Truth stripped of polish, of strategy, of pretense. JD lowered the glove, but the silence remained, as heavy and complete as if the walls themselves listened. You can tell me about the future all you want, but if we can't build a future that honors the sacrifices of our past, then what exactly are we building? He said no more. He didn't need to. The room stayed silent as JD returned to his seat, the glove resting beside him now, a quiet symbol that spoke louder than any speech he might have prepared. And across the country, in places forgotten by lobbyists and ignored by the markets, Americans watching leaned in, hearts beating faster, sensing that perhaps, just perhaps, the tide was beginning to turn. The glove rested quietly on the table beside JD as he drew a slow breath, steadying himself in the silence his words had created. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. The weight of his father's memory, of the boy's question that still echoed in his heart, had opened the room to a deeper truth. Now it was time to show them what that truth looked like. Without rushing, JD reached into his worn leather briefcase, the sound of the metal clasp snapping open loud in the stillness. From within, he drew out something unexpected, not papers or charts or reports, but a faded, threadbare safety vest. Its once bright orange had dulled to rust. The reflective stripes were cracked and fraying at the edges. He held it up slowly, letting the chamber take in the sight. The camera zoomed in instinctively, capturing every detail, the stains, the torn stitching, the patches where the fabric had thinned from years of use and neglect. "This," JD said, his voice quiet but unwavering, "is what's left when we choose Wall Street over Main Street." The words fell into the silence like a challenge, like a verdict. And as he spoke them, the room shifted again, not with the calculated applause of lobbyists or the practiced nods of polished politicians, but with something deeper. The gallery leaned in, drawn not by spectacle, but by the raw honesty of what they saw. JD's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on faces that had looked skeptical moments before. "This belonged to a man I met while visiting one of the towns this bill was written for. A man who worked every day he could until there was no work left. A man who, when the factory closed, didn't ask for handouts, he asked for a chance. This vest was the last thing he kept from that job, a reminder not of failure, but of dignity." In the front row of the gallery, a union leader, weathered and proud, lifted a hand to his face, wiping at a tear he hadn't expected to fall. Beside him, others sat straighter, their attention no longer divided, no longer dulled by policy speak and economic theory. JD hadn't just reclaimed the room. He had claimed its conscience. This isn't about nostalgia. This isn't about refusing to move forward. It's about deciding what kind of future we're moving toward. One where men and women like the person who wore this vest have a place, or one where they're left behind so others can profit. Romney shifted slightly in his seat, his earlier certainty now met with something harder to counter than numbers or expert statements. JD hadn't brought data today. He'd brought reality, the kind that couldn't be dismissed with a report or a soundbite. The cameras captured every second, broadcasting not just a debate, but a reckoning. And across the country, in union halls and living rooms, in diners and break rooms, Americans watched and saw not a senator making a case, but a man making a stand. JD lowered the vest, his hand lingering for a moment on the frayed fabric before he folded it carefully and set it beside the glove. His voice softened, but its strength remained. "We don't build a future by forgetting where we came from. We build it by honoring those who carried us this far and making sure they're not left behind now." And as he stepped back, the room remained silent, not with indifference, but with the kind of silence that comes when people are finally made to see. The room remained frozen in that charged silence, the worn glove and the faded safety vest resting side by side like quiet witnesses to a truth that no speech had managed to voice until now. JD stepped back, his head held high, his gaze steady, as if daring anyone to look away from what he had laid bare. And for a long moment, no one did. Then slowly Romney rose. His movements were precise, deliberate, as they always were. But this time something was different. The poise was there, but beneath it a shadow of hesitation flickered, a crack in the polished armor. The room turned toward him as one, cameras refocusing, eyes narrowing in anticipation of the counterstrike that surely must come. Romney drew a breath, preparing to speak. But as his gaze swept over the room, the glove, the vest, the faces of senators who moments ago had nodded along with him, but now sat thoughtful, their certainty unsettled, something in his practiced composure wavered. His mouth opened, but the words did not come. The line he might have planned, the argument he might have delivered with surgical precision, faltered on his lips. Because this was no longer a debate of numbers or forecasts. This was no longer about future projections or economic models. This was about human dignity, laid bare in worn leather and frayed fabric, and for once, rhetoric had no place to hide. The chairman's voice broke the tension, soft but pointed. "Senator Romney?" Romney's eyes flicked toward him, as if drawn back from some inner struggle. He straightened slightly, tried again, but found nothing that could stand against what had been said, what had been shown. And so, without a word, he sank slowly back into his chair, his hands folded on the table, not in victory, not in control, but in quiet resignation to the fact that, for this moment, he had been bested, not by clever strategy, but by moral weight. The room held its breath. The cameras, so often hungry for sound bites and conflict, captured instead the rarest of moments, the silence of power confronted by truth. JD remained still, not triumphant, but resolute. This wasn't about defeating Romney. It was about breaking through the polished veneer that had too long covered the harsh realities people lived every day. And in that silence, he had done it. In the gallery, the union leader who had wiped away his tear earlier now sat with his hands clasped, head bowed slightly, not in defeat, but in silent acknowledgement of what he'd just witnessed. Around him, others leaned forward, breath caught, as if afraid that even a whisper might break the spell of the moment. Across the country, the scene played out on screens large and small. In diners and break rooms, in living rooms and factory offices, Americans watched and felt a weight lift. Not because their struggles were over, but because, for the first time in a long time, they felt seen. Romney remained silent, eyes lowered, as the chairman cleared his throat again, this time guiding the hearing forward. But nothing in the room would be quite the same. The balance had shifted, and everyone there felt it. And as JD settled into his seat, his hand resting lightly on the glove, the chamber's quiet wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of reckoning, of the simple, powerful truth that no amount of power or polish could silence what was real. The quiet in the chamber felt different now. It wasn't the heavy, uncertain silence that had followed Romney's masterstroke, nor was it the expectant hush that had filled the room before JD spoke. This was something else entirely. A silence full of weight and wonder, as if everyone present recognized that they just witnessed a shift, though few dared say it aloud. JD remained still, his hand resting on the worn glove, his eyes steady on the room, on the senators who now avoided his gaze, or met it with something more complicated than before. Respect, reflection, unease. Across from him, Romney sat silent, his earlier confidence dulled by the force of a truth he had no words to answer. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a soft creak of leather and wood, an elder senator, a man whose voice carried weight not through bluster, but through decades of service and an unshakable sense of principle, rose slowly to his feet. The room turned toward him as one. He hadn't spoken much in these hearings, content until now to listen, to weigh, to measure. But as he stood, his back straight despite the years, his eyes clear beneath the silver of his hair, the chamber seemed to draw a collective breath. He didn't look at JD at first. His gaze swept the room, pausing on faces familiar with the comfort of consensus, with the safety of following rather than leading. And when he spoke, his voice was firm, not loud, but strong enough to fill the space without strain. There are moments in this chamber when we're called not to calculate, but to choose, he said, his words deliberate, each one falling into the silence like a stone in still water. Today I choose courage over comfort. I choose to support Senator Vance's bill. For a heartbeat, the room stayed frozen. Then came the first sound, a sharp intake of breath, a gasp from somewhere in the gallery. The ripple of surprise moved through the chamber, like wind across tall grass. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Senators shifted, caught off guard, some by the substance of what had been said, others by the fact that it had been said at all. The elder senator's eyes now met JD's, and in them was no bravado, no performance, only the quiet resolve of a man who had decided what mattered most. "We can talk of futures and forecasts all we want," he continued, "but a future built on leaving good people behind is no future worth having." The camera swung toward him, capturing not just his face, but the faces of those now forced to reconsider, to rethink, to feel the shift in momentum that was no longer theoretical, but real and present in the room. JD inclined his head slightly, in gratitude but also in solidarity. The tide was turning, not by force, not by spectacle, but by the simple, undeniable power of truth finding a voice beyond his own. And beyond the walls of that chamber, in the homes and halls where people watched and waited, hope stirred anew. This wasn't over. It was, at last, truly beginning. The elder senator's voice still seemed to echo in the chamber, his declaration hanging in the air like a torch passed from hand to hand. The room, once heavy with doubt and polished arguments, felt changed, as if, in that single act of courage, the spell of inevitability had been broken. But the shift was not confined to the polished wood and marble of the hearing room. Outside, the storm JD had stirred now roared into life. It began as a murmur, almost lost beneath the city's hum, the sound of voices rising together, gathering strength. The crowds that had assembled on the Capitol steps, that had waited through the long hours of debate and doubt, now found their voice. "American jobs for American families." The chant grew, echoing off the stone walls, rising like a wave that could no longer be ignored. Flags waved, some old and frayed, others fresh from eager hands. Signs lifted high-bore messages scrawled in marker, in paint, in whatever people had. "Save our towns," "We are Main Street," JD Vance, "Our voice." News cameras turned, drawn by the sound, by the sight of something real unfolding beyond their scripts and talking points. The anchors, seated in sleek studios, their voices polished for broadcast, struggled to contain their surprise. "What we're seeing here is remarkable," one said, his tone edged with awe. "A political earthquake, unfolding live." "This isn't just about one bill anymore," another added. "This is a movement." The images beamed across the nation, a sea of faces no longer silent, no longer willing to wait politely for promises that never came. They cheered, they chanted, they stood together as if to say, "We are still here, and we matter." Inside the hearing room, the sound filtered through the thick doors and stone walls, faint at first but impossible to ignore. Staffers glanced toward the windows. Senators shifted in their chairs. The polished surface of power, so often untouched by the voices beyond, felt the tremor. JD sat quietly listening. He didn't smile, didn't grandstand, but his eyes softened, the weight of the moment settling in a different way now. Not as a burden, but as a promise taking shape. Romney remained still, his hands folded, gaze lowered, the certainty that had carried him into this battle now met by a force he hadn't counted on. The people. And the people didn't stop. Their chorus swelled, their words no longer just a chant, but a declaration. "American jobs for American families." Across the country, in living rooms, in factories, in schools and shops, people watched and felt the pull of that chorus. Some rose to their feet, others wiped tears they hadn't expected. And in those small moments, scattered across states and cities, the distance between the chamber and the streets grew smaller. The chairman tapped his gavel gently, more to center the room than to silence it. The hearing would go on, but nothing about it was the same. The tide had turned, and everyone, inside and out, knew it. The chant outside the Capitol still echoed faintly through its grand halls as the hearing adjourned for the day. But inside, where the real battle would now be fought, the atmosphere had shifted. The polished calm of the Senate's private corridors felt thinner somehow, as if the voices of the people beyond the stone walls had seeped into the very air, refusing to be shut out. JD moved through those corridors with purpose, flanked by a small, loyal team that spoke little, knowing this was his moment to seize. The elder senator who had stood for him earlier had quietly opened doors, offering introductions, nods of quiet encouragement. But now it was JD's words alone that would determine what came next. One by one, in offices lined with books and portraits, in the quiet weight of history, he met with the undecided, the swing senators who, until now, had stayed safely on the sidelines. Senators who had watched the spectacle, weighed the arguments, and waited to see which way the wind would blow. JD didn't bring charts. He didn't bring prepared statements or policy binders thick with statistics. He brought his truth and the steady force of conviction that had begun to change the air of the Capitol itself. "You've heard the speeches," he said, his voice low but sure, passion burning beneath its calm surface. "You've seen the faces in that gallery and outside these walls. This bill isn't perfect. No bill is. But it's a start at building a future that doesn't leave those people behind." Some met his gaze evenly, listening with arms folded but eyes open. Others shifted uncomfortably, torn between political calculation and the pull of conscience stirred by the roar of voices still fresh in their memory. JD didn't plead. He didn't bargain. He spoke of what he'd seen: the towns abandoned, the families displaced, the father with no answer for his child. And always he spoke of what could be, a future where courage mattered more than comfort, where standing up meant more than standing by. "This isn't about left or right," he told them. "It's about right and wrong." And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the ground began to shift. A senator who had stayed silent during the hearings now nodded just once, but enough. Another, long skeptical, leaned forward, fingers steepled, asking questions not of obstruction, but of understanding. Behind closed doors, away from cameras and crowds, conscience found its voice. The chants outside the Capitol became more than noise. They became a force no one could deny. And one by one, some crossed that invisible line, stepping away from safe neutrality and towards something braver. JD left each room the same way he'd entered, steady, respectful, resolute. He knew there would be no guarantees. But as he walked those quiet halls, the voices outside seemed louder now, not in volume, but in meaning. And as night fell over the Capitol once more, the storm had changed shape. It was no longer just the storm JD had stirred. It was the storm of a people who would not be ignored, and of lawmakers who at last began to listen. The chamber was filled with a tension so thick it seemed to hum beneath the marble and wood. The time had come. After all the arguments, all the testimony, all the moments of doubt and defiance, the vote was at hand. JD sat motionless, his hands resting on the table, the worn glove beside him like a quiet reminder of every promise he carried. Around him, senators prepared to cast their choices, some with certainty, others with the weight of decision heavy on their faces. The clerk called the roll, each name a drum beat in the hearts of those watching. JD kept his eyes forward, his breath steady, but inside, every vote felt like an eternity. A yes lifted hope, a no sank it. The tally grew, vote by vote, the margin razor thin, the chamber holding its collective breath with each answer spoken into the record. Outside, the crowds listened, watched, waited. The chants had quieted now, replaced by a deep, expectant silence, as if the entire nation held its breath alongside the man who had dared to hope in public. The clerk reached the final names, voice steady, though even she could not hide the tremor beneath the formality. The tally was read aloud. The bill had passed, by the narrowest of margins, but passed all the same. For a heartbeat there was only silence, the kind that follows an earthquake when the world adjusts to its new shape. And then the chamber erupted, not in division, but in release. Applause rang out, loud and insistent, joined by cheers from the gallery. The elder senator who had stood first now stood again, clapping with the force of a man who knew he'd witnessed history. JD exhaled, slow, controlled, though inside the storm of relief and emotion surged fierce and deep. The glove lay on the table, still, but in that moment it felt lighter, as if the promise it represented had begun to be honored at last. When the chamber calmed, the chairman nodded toward JD. The moment was his, The cameras turned, the room leaned in, the nation waited. JD rose, his posture steady, his voice rough with emotion, but strong enough to carry to every corner of the room and beyond. "We didn't win for me," he began, pausing to let the words settle. "We won for those who built this country, and for those who will rebuild it." He let his gaze sweep the room, meeting the eyes of allies and skeptics alike. This bill, this day, is not about politics. It's about people. It's about making sure we remember who we are and who we owe. It's about saying, finally and clearly, that we will not leave them behind. The room was silent except for the sound of JD's voice, steady despite the roughness, each word shaped by conviction rather than calculation. "I stand here because of a father who worked to steal until there was no steel left to work, because of a boy who asked his father why they no longer had a home, because of the thousands who have asked that same question in town after town across this country." He paused, breath catching just slightly. "And today we begin to answer them." The chamber rose as one, applause swelling into a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls. The elder senator clapped until his hands reddened. The gallery stood with tears in many eyes, and the roar from outside began anew. JD lowered his head slightly in quiet gratitude, knowing this was not the end, but the beginning of the work still to come. The sun had begun to break through the clouds as JD stepped out onto the Capitol steps, the storm of the night before giving way to soft light that touched the stone with gold. The crowds below erupted at the sight of him, voices rising in a chorus of hope and triumph. JD paused at the top of the steps, the glove held high in his hand, not as a trophy, but as a symbol, a promise made and kept. Flags waved, hands lifted, voices joined. JD, JD, American jobs for American families. He descended slowly, not because he was weary, but because he wanted to see them, all of them. The workers, the families, the young, the old. Those who had stood with him in spirit and in voice. Near the front, a boy no older than JD had been on that cold day so long ago, tugged at his mother's sleeve, eyes wide with wonder. "I want to be like him," the boy whispered, his words lost to most in the roar, but not to his mother, who smiled through tears. JD reached the bottom of the steps and paused again, letting the moment settle into memory. He glanced toward the Capitol, its dome now bright against the morning sky, and felt the weight of the day lift, replaced by something new. The weight of what came next, the responsibility of legacy, the promise of the work ahead. The dawn broke fully then, light spilling over the city, over the crowd, over the man who had stood when it counted. And as the chant rose again, carrying across the city and beyond, JD knew this was only the beginning. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't about loud promises or polished speeches. It's about standing firm when it matters most and giving voice to those too often forgotten. JD's journey showed that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, in the choice to keep fighting when the world tells you to give up. The work glove and the safety vest weren't just symbols. They were reminders of real people, real sacrifice, and the responsibility we all share to honor them. In the end, JD's triumph wasn't his alone. It belonged to every worker, every family, every town that dared to hope again. And maybe that's the lesson. Change begins when we stop waiting for heroes and choose to become part of the fight ourselves. What do you think makes someone a true leader today? Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right when it wasn't easy? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.